Hello again, guys. This is Leah. Thank you so much for being patient with me. I decided to take a bit of a long break since it was spring break, whatnot, here on college campus. I'd like to thank UNCW for allowing me to rent the space and equipment. And we're going to get right back into Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls. And we're going to be talking about chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9. By late evening, the happy tune I had been whistling was forgotten. My back throbbed like a stone bruise. The muscles in my legs and arms started quivering and jerking. I couldn't gulp enough air to cool the burning heat in my lungs. My strength was gone. I could go no further. I sat down and called my dogs to me. With tears in my eyes, I told them I just couldn't cut this big tree down. I was trying hard to make them understand when I heard someone coming. It was Grandpa in his buggy. I'm sure no one in the world can understand a young boy like his grandfather can. He drove up with a twinkle in his eyes and a smile on his whiskery old face. "Hello! How are you getting along?" he boomed. "Not so good, Grandpa," I said. "I don't think I can cut it down. It's just too big, I guess. I'm gonna have to give up." "Give up?" Grandpa barked. "Now, I don't want to hear you say that. No, sir, that's the last thing I want to hear. Don't ever start anything you can't finish." "I don't want to give up, Grandpa," I said, "but it's just too big, and my strength's gone. I'm give out." "Course you are," he said. "You've been going at it wrong. To do work like that, a fellow needs plenty of rest and food in his stomach." "How am I going to get that, Grandpa?" I asked. "I can't leave the tree. If I do, the coon will get away." "No, he won't," Grandpa said. "That's what I came down here for. I'll show you how to keep that coon in that tree." He walked around the big sycamore, looking up. He whistled and said, "Whew, boy, this is a big one all right." "Yes, it is, Grandpa," I said. "It's the biggest one in the river bottoms." Grandpa started chuckling. "That's all right," he said. "The bigger they are, the harder they fall." "How are you going to make the coon stay in the tree, Grandpa?" I asked. With a proud look on his face, he said, "That's another one of my coon hunting tricks. Learned it when I was a boy. We'll keep him there all right." "Oh, and I don't mean we can keep him there for always, but he'll stay for 4 or 5 days. That is, until he gets so hungry he just has to come down." "I don't need that much time," I said. "I'm pretty sure I can have it down by tomorrow night." Grandpa looked at the cut. "I don't know," he said. "Even though it is halfway down, you must remember, you've been cutting it half of one night and one day. You might make it, but it's going to take a lot of chopping." "If I get a good night's sleep," I said, "and a couple of meals under my belt, I can do a lot of chopping." Grandpa laughed. "Speaking of meals," he said, "your ma's having chicken and dumplings for supper. Now, we don't want to miss that, so let's get busy." "What do you want me to do, Grandpa?" I asked. "Well, let's see," he said. "First thing we'll need is some sticks about 5 feet long. Take your axe. Go over in that cane brake and get us 6 of them." I hurried to do what Grandpa wanted, all the time wondering what in the world he was going to do. How could he keep that coon in that tree? When I came back, he was taking some old clothes from the buggy. "Take this stocking cap," he said. "Fill it about halfway full of grass and leaves." While I was doing this, Grandpa walked over and started looking up in the tree. "You're pretty sure he's in that hollow limb, are you?" he asked. "He's there all right, Grandpa," I said. "There's no other place he could be. I've looked all over it, and there's no hollow anywhere." "Well, in that case," Grandpa said, "we better put our man along about here." "What man, Grandpa?" I asked in surprise. "The one we're going to make," he said. "To us, it'll be a scarecrow, but to that coon, it'll be a man." Knowing too well how smart coons were, right away I began to lose confidence. "I don't see how anything like that can keep a coon in a tree," I said. "It'll keep him there all right," Grandpa said. "Like I told you before, they're curious little devils. He'll poke his head out of that hole, see this man standing there, and he won't dare come down. It'll take him 4 or 5 days to figure out that it wasn't a real, honest-to-goodness man. By that time, it'll be too late. You'll have his hide tacked on the smokehouse wall. The more I thought about it, the more I believed it. And then there was that serious look on Grandpa's face. That was all it took. I was firmly convinced. I started laughing. The more I thought about it, the funnier it got. Great big laughing tears rolled down my cheek. "Oh, what's so funny?" Grandpa asked. "Don't you believe it'll work?" "Sure it'll work, Grandpa," I said. "I know it will. I was just thinking, those coons aren't half as smart as they think they are they?" We had a good laugh at this. With the sticks and some baling wire, Grandpa made a frame that looked almost like a gingerbread man. On this he put an old pair of pants and a red sweater. We stuffed the loose flabby clothes with grass and leaves, and he wired the stocking cap head in place and stepped back to inspect his work. "Well, what do you think of it?" he asked. "If it had a face," I said, "you couldn't tell it from a real man." "We can fix that," Grandpa chuckled. He took a stick and dug some black grease from one of the hubby caps on the buggy. I stood and watched while he applied his artistic touch. In the stocking cap head, he made 2 mean-looking eyes, a crooked nose, and the ugliest mouth I had ever seen. He was downright ferocious. "Well, what do you think of that?" he asked. "Looks pretty good, huh?" Laughing fit to kill and talking all at the same time, I told him that I wouldn't blame the coon if he stayed in the tree until Gabriel blew his horn. "Now, he won't stay that long," my grandpa chuckled, "but he'll stay long enough for you to cut that tree down." "That's all I want," I said. "We better get going," Grandpa said. "It's getting late, and I don't want to miss supper." I was so stiff and sore he had to help me to the buggy seat. I called to my dogs. Little Ann came, but not willingly. Old Dan refused to leave the tree. "Come on, boy," I coaxed. "Let's go home and get something to eat. We'll come back tomorrow." He bowed his head and looked the other way. "Come on," I scolded. "We can't sit here all night." This hurt his feelings. He walked around behind the big sycamore and hid. "Well, I'll be darned," Grandpa said as he jumped down from the buggy. "He knows that coon's there and he doesn't want to leave it. You've got a coon hound there, and I mean a good one." He picked up old Dan in his arms and set him in the buggy. All the way home, I had to hold on to his collar to keep him from jumping out and going back to that tree. As our buggy wound its way up through the bottoms, Grandpa started talking. "You know, Billy," he said, "about this tree chopping of yours. I think it's all right. In fact, I think it would be a good thing if all young boys had to cut down a big tree like that once in their life. It does something for them. It gives them determination and willpower. That's a good thing for a man to have. It goes a long way in his life. The American people have a lot of it. They have proved that, all down through history. But they could do with a lot more of it." I couldn't see this determination and willpower that Grandpa was talking about very clearly. All I could see was a big sycamore tree, a lot of chopping, and the hide of a ringtail coon that I was determined to have. As we reached the house, Mama came out. Right away, she started checking me over. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Sure, Mama," I said. "What makes you think something's wrong with me?" "Well, I don't know," she said. The way you acted when you got down from the buggy, I just thought that maybe you were hurt." "Oh, he's just a little sore and stiff from all that chopping," Grandpa said. "But he'll be all right. That'll go soon enough away." After Mama saw that there were no broken bones or legs chopped off, she smiled and said, "Oh, I don't know anymore. I guess I'll just have to get used to it." Papa hollered from the porch, "Come on in. We've been waiting supper on you." We're having chicken and dumplings, Mama beamed, and I cooked them especially for you. During the meal, I told Grandpa I didn't think that the coon in the big tree was the same one my dogs had been trailing at first. What makes you think that? He asked. I told how the coon had fooled us and how little Ann had seen or heard this other coon. I figured he had just walked up on my dogs before he realized it. A smile spread all over Grandpa's face. Chuckling, he said, "It does look that way, but it wasn't." No, Billy, it was the same coon. They're much too smart to ever walk up on a hound like that. He pulled a trick, and it was a good one. In fact, it'll fool 9 out of 10 dogs. Well, what did he do, Grandpa? I asked. I'm pretty sure he didn't cross the river, so how did he work it? Grandpa put the dishes back, and using his fork as a pencil, he drew an imaginary line on the tablecloth. It's called the backtracking trick, he said. That's how he worked it up. He climbed that water oak, but he only went up about 15 or 20 feet. Then he turned around and came down his same tracks. He backtracked on his original trail for a way, and when he heard your dogs coming, he leapt far up onto the side of the nearest tree and climbed up. He was in that tree all the time your dogs were searching for the lost trail. After everything had quieted down, he figured that they had given up. And that's when he came down, and that's when little Ann either saw or heard him. Pointing the fork at me, Grandpa said very seriously, "You mark my word, Billy. In no time at all, that little Ann will know every trick a coon can pull." You know, Grandpa, I said, she wouldn't bark treat at that water oak like old Dan did. Of course she wouldn't, he said. She knew he wasn't there. Why, I'd never heard of such a thing, Mama said. I'd no idea coons were that smart. Why, for all anybody knows, he may not be in that big tree at all. Maybe he pulled another trick. It'd be a shame if Billy cut it down and found there was no coon in it. Oh, he's there, Mama, I hastily replied. I know he is. They were right on his trail when he went up. Besides, little Ann was bawling her head off when I came to them. Of course he's there, Grandpa said. They were crowding him too closely. He didn't have a time to pull another trick. Grandpa soon left after supper, saying to me, I'll be back down in a few days, and I want to see that coon hide. I thanked him for helping me and walked out to the buggy with him. Oh, I almost forgot, he said. I heard there was a fad back in the New England states. Seems like everyone is going crazy over coonskin coats. Now, if this is true, I look for the price of coon hides to take a jump. I was happy to hear this and told my father what Grandpa had said. Papa laughed and said, Well, if you can keep the coons out of those big sycamores, you might make a little bit of money. Before I went to bed, Mama made me a hot bath. Then she rubbed me all over with some liniment that burned like fire and smelled like a civet cat. Ugh. Seemed like I had barely closed my eyes when Mama woke me up. Breakfast is about ready, Billy, she said. I was so stiff and sore, I had trouble putting my clothes on. Mama helped me. Maybe you'd better let that coon go, she said. I don't think he's worth all this. I can't do that, Mama, I said. I've gone too far now. Papa came in from the barn. What's the matter? He asked. You a little stiff? A little stiff, Mama exclaimed. Why, he could hardly put his clothes on. Oh, he'll be all right, Papa said. If I know anything about swinging an axe, it won't be long before he's limber as a rag. Mama just shook her head and started putting our breakfast on the table. While we were eating, Papa said, You know, I woke up several times last night, and each time I was sure I heard a hound bawling. It sounded like old Dan. I quit the table on the run and headed for my doghouse. I didn't have to go all the way. Little Ann met me on the porch. I asked her where old Dan was and called his name. He was nowhere around. Little Ann started acting strangely. She whined and stared towards the river bottoms. She ran out to the gate, came back, and reared up on me. Mama and Papa came out onto the porch. He's not here, I said. I think he's gone back to that tree. I don't think he'd do that. Would he? Mama said. Maybe he's around someplace. Have you looked in the doghouse? I ran and looked. He wasn't there. Everybody quiet. Listen, I said. I walked out beyond the gate a little ways and whooped as loud as I could. My voice rang like a bell in the still, frosty morn. Before the echo had died away, the deep "Oh" of old Dan rolled out of the river bottoms. He's there, I said. He wanted to make sure the coon stayed in the tree. You see, Mama, why I have to get that coon? I can't let him down. Well, I never in all my life, she said. I had no idea a dog loved to hunt that much. Yes, Billy, I can see now. And I want you to go get him. I don't care if you have to cut down every tree in those bottoms. I want you to get that coon for those dogs. I'm going to get him, Mama, I said. And I'm going to get him today if I possibly can. Papa laughed and said, Looks like there wasn't any use in building that scarecrow. All you had to tell was old Dan to stay and watch the tree. I left the house in a run. Now and then I would stop and whoop. Each time I was answered by the deep voice of old Dan. Oh! Little Ann ran ahead of me. By the time I reached the big tree, their voices were making the bottoms ring. When I came tearing out of the underbrush, old Dan threw a fit. He tried to climb the sycamore. He would back way off. Then, bawling and running as fast as he could, he would claw his way far up on its side. Little Ann, not to be outdone, reared and placed her small front paws on the smooth white bark. She told that ringtail coon that she knew he was there. After they had quieted down, I called old Dan to me. I'm proud of you, boy, I said. Takes a good dog to stay with a tree all night. But there wasn't any need for you in coming back. The coon wouldn't have gotten away. That's why we built the scarecrow, silly. Little Ann came over to me and started rolling in the leaves. The way I was feeling towards her, I couldn't even smile at her playful mood. Of course you feel good, I said in an irritated voice. And it's no wonder. You had a good night's sleep in a nice warm doghouse. But old Dan didn't. He was down here in the cold all by himself, watching that tree. The way you're acting, I don't believe you care if the coon gets away or not. I would have said more, but just then I noticed something. I walked over for a better look. There, scratched deep in the soft leaves, were two little beds. One was smaller than the other. Looking at little Ann, I read the answer in her warm gray eyes. Old Dan hadn't been alone when he had gone back to the tree. She too had gone along. There was no doubt that in the early morning she had come home to get me. There was a lump in my throat when I said, I'm sorry, little Ann. I'm sorry, girl. I should have known. The first half hour was torture. Each swing of the axe in my arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. I gritted my teeth and kept hacking away. My body felt like it did the time my sister rolled me down the hill in a barrel. As Papa had said, in a little while the warm heat from the hard work limbered me up. I remembered what my father did when he was swinging an axe. At the completion of each swing, he always said, "Ha! I tried it. Kerwham! Ha! Kerwham! Ha!" I don't know if it helped or not, but I was willing to try anything if it would hurry the job along. Several times before noon, I had to stop and rake my chips out of the way. I noticed that they weren't the big, even, solid chips like my father made when he was chopping. They were small and seemed to crumble up and come all to pieces. Neither were the cuts neat and even. They were ragged and looked more like the work of beavers. But I wasn't interested in any beautiful tree chopping. All I wanted was to hear the big sycamore start popping. Along the middle of the afternoon, I felt a stinging in one of my hands. When I saw it was a blister, I almost cried. At first there was only one, then two. One after another, they rose up on my hands like small white marbles. They filled up and turned a pale pinkish color. When one would burst, it was all I could do from screaming. I tore my handkerchief in half and wrapped my hands. This helped for a while, but when the cloth began to stick to the raw flesh, I knew it was the end. Crying my heart out, I called my dogs to me and showed them my hands. I can't do it, I said. I've tried, but I just can't cut it down. I can't hold the axe any longer. Leland whined and started licking my sore hands. Old Dan seemed to understand. He showed his sympathy by nuzzling me with his head. Broken-hearted, I started for home. As I turned from the corner of my eye, I saw Grandpa Scarecrow. It seemed to be laughing at me. I looked over to the big sycamore. It lacked so little being cut down. A small wedge of solid wood was all that it was holding up. I let my eyes follow the smooth, white trunk up to the huge, spreading limbs. Sobbing, I said, "You think you may have won, but you haven't. Although I can't get the coon, neither can you live, because I have to cut off your breath of life." And then I thought, why kill the big tree and not accomplish anything? I began to feel bad. Kneeling down between my dogs, I cried and prayed. Please, God, please give me the strength to finish the job. I don't want to leave the big tree like that. Please help me finish the job. I was trying to rewrap my hands so I could go back to work when I heard a low droning sound. I stood up and looked around. I could hear the noise, but couldn't quite locate it. I looked up. High in the top of the big sycamore, a breeze had started the limbs swaying. A shudder ran through the huge trunk. I looked over to my right at the big black gum tree. Not one limb was moving. On its branches, a few dead leaves hung silent and still. One dropped and floated lazily toward the ground. Over on my left stood a large hackberry. I looked up to see its top, and it was still as a fence post. Another gust of wind caught up in the big top of the sycamore tree. It started popping and snapping. I knew it was going to fall. Grabbing my dogs by the collars, I backed off to safety. I held my breath. The top of the big sycamore rocked and swayed. There was a loud crack that seemed to come from deep inside the heavy trunk. Fascinated, I stood and watched the giant of the bottoms. It seemed to be fighting so hard to keep standing. Several times, I thought it would fall, but in a miraculous way, it would pull itself back into perfect balance. The wind itself seemed to be angry at the big tree's stubbornness. It growled and moaned as it pushed harder against the wavering top. With one final, grinding, creaking sigh, the big sycamore started down. It picked up momentum as the heavy weight of the overbalanced top dove for the ground. A small ash was smothered by its large bulk. There was a lightning-like crack as its trunk snapped in half. In its downward plunge, the huge limbs stripped the branches from the smaller trees. A log-sized one knifed through the top of a water oak. Splintered limbs flew skyward and rained out over the bottoms. With a cyclone roar, the big tree crashed to the ground. And then, silence settled over the bottoms. Out of the broken, twisted, tangled mass streaked a brown furry ball. I turned my dogs loose and started screaming at the top of my lungs. "Get him, Dan! Get him!" In his eagerness, old Dan ran head-on into a bur oak tree. He sat down, and with his deep voice, he told the river bottoms that he had been hurt. Oh, it was little Ann who had caught the coon. I heard the ringtail squall when she grabbed him. Scared half to death, I snatched up a club and ran to her. The coon was all over her. He climbed up on her head, growling, slashing, ripping, and tearing. Yelping with pain, she shook him off, and he streaked for the river. I thought surely he was going to get away. At the very edge of the riverbank, she caught him again. I was trying hard to get in a lick with my club, but couldn't for fear of hitting little Ann. Through the tears in my eyes, I saw the red, blurry form of old Dan sail into the fight. He was a mad hound. His anger at the bur oak tree was taken out on the coon. They stretched old Ringing out between them and pinned him to the ground. It was savage and brutal. I could hear the dying squalls of the coon and the deep growls of old Dan. In a short time, it was all over. With sorrow in my heart, I stood and watched while my dogs worried the lifeless body. Little Ann was satisfied first. I had to scold old Dan to make him stop. Carrying the coon by a hind leg, I walked back to the big tree for my axe. Before leaving home, I stood and looked at the fallen sycamore. I should have felt proud over the job I had done, but for some reason, I couldn't. I knew I would miss the shine of the bottoms, for it had played a wonderful part in my life. I thought of the hours I had whiled away staring at its beauty, and how hard it had been finding the right name for it. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't want to cut you down, but I had to. I hope you can understand." I was a proud boy as I walked along in the twilight of the evening. I felt so good even my sore hands had stopped hurting. What boy wouldn't be proud? Hadn't my little hounds treed and killed their first coon? Along about then, I decided I was a full-fledged coon hunter. Nearing our house, I saw the whole family had come out on the porch. My sisters came running, staring wide-eyed at the dead coon. Laughing, Papa said, "Well, I see you got him." "I sure did, Papa," I said. I held the coon up for all to see. Mama took one look at the lifeless body and winced. "Billy," she said, "when I heard that big tree fall, it scared me half to death. I didn't know, but what if it had fallen on you, you know?" "Oh, Mama," I said, "I was safe. Why, I backed way off onto one side. Couldn't have fallen on me." Mama just shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "Sometimes I wonder if all mothers have to go through this." "Come on," Papa said. "I'll help you skin it." While we were tacking the hide on the smokehouse wall, I asked Papa if he had noticed any wind blowing that evening. He thought a bit and said, "No, I don't believe I did. I've been out here all day, and I'm pretty sure I would have noticed something, especially any wind. Why'd you ask?" "Oh, I don't know, Papa," I said, "but I thought something strange happened down in the bottoms this afternoon." "I'm afraid I don't understand," said Papa. "What do you mean, something strange happened?" I told him about how my hands had gotten so sore I couldn't chop no more, and how I had asked for strength to finish the job. "Well, what's so strange about that?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, "but I didn't chop the big tree down. The wind blew it over." "Why, that's nothing," Papa said. "I've seen that happen a lot of times." "It wasn't just the wind," I said. "The way it blew, it didn't touch any other tree in the bottoms. I know because I looked around. The big tree was the only one it touched by the wind." Do you think God heard my prayer? Do you think he helped me?" Papa looked at the ground and scratched his head. In a sober voice, he said, "I don't know, Billy. I'm afraid I can't answer that. You must remember the big sycamore was the tallest tree in the bottoms. Maybe it was up there high enough to catch the wind where the others couldn't. No, I'm afraid I can't help you there. You'll have to decide for yourself." It wasn't hard for me to decide. I was firmly convinced that I had been helped.
Chapter 10. Mama made me a cap out of my first coon hide. I was as proud of it as Papa would have been if someone had given him a dozen Missouri mules. Mama said afterwards that she wished she hadn't made it for me because, in some way, wearing that cap must have affected my mind. I went coon crazy. I was out after the ringtails every night. About the only time I didn't go hunting was when the weather was bad, and even then Mama all but had to hog-tie me. What wonderful nights they were, running like a deer through the thick timber of the bottoms, tearing my way through strands of wild cane, drifting, climbing over drifts and jumping logs, running, screaming and yelling, "Woo-wee! Get 'em, boy, get 'em!" followed by the voices of my little hounds. It wasn't too hard for a smart old coon to fool old Dan, but there were none that prowled the riverbanks that could fool my little Ann. As Grandpa had predicted, the price of coonskins jumped sky high. A good-sized hide was worth from $4 to $10, depending on the grade and the quality. I kept the side of our smokehouse plastered with hides. Of course, I would spread them out a little to cover more space. I always stretched them on the side facing the road, never on the back side. I wanted everyone in the country to see them. The money earned from my furs was turned over to my father. I didn't care about it. I had what I wanted, my dogs. I suppose that Papa was saving it for something because I never saw anything new turn up around our home, but like any young boy, I wasn't bothered by it and asked no questions. My whole life was wrapped up in my dogs. Everywhere I went, they went along. There was only one place I didn't want them to go with me, and that was to Grandpa's store. Other dogs were always there, and it seemed as if all they wanted to was to jump on old Dan. It got so about the only time I went to see my grandfather was when I had a bundle of fur to take to the store. This was always a problem. In every way I could, I would try to slip away from my dogs. Sometimes I swore that they could read my mind. Made no difference what I tried. I couldn't fool them. One time, I was sure I had outsmarted them. The day before I was to make one of my trips, I took my furs out of the barn and hid them. The next morning, I hung around the house for a while, and then nonchalantly whistled my way out to the barn. I climbed up in the loft and peeked through a crack. I could see them lying in front of their doghouse. They weren't even looking my way. Taking my furs, I sneaked out through a back door, and walking like a tomcat, I made it to the timber. I climbed a small dogwood tree and looked back. They were still there, and didn't seem to know what I'd done. Feeling just about as smart as Sherlock Holmes, I headed for the store. I was walking along, singing my lungs out when they came tearing out of the underbrush, wiggling and twisting and tickled to death to be with me. At first I was mad, but one look at dancing little Ann and all was forgiven. I sat down on my bundle of fur and laughed till I hurt all over. I could scold them a little, but I could no more have whipped one of them than I could have kissed a girl. After all, a boy just doesn't whip his dogs. Grandpa always counted my furs carefully and marked something down on a piece of paper. I'd never seen him do this with other hunters, and it got the best of my curiosity. One day while he was writing, I asked him, "Why do you do that, Grandpa?" He looked at me over his glasses and said, kind of sharp, "Never mind, I have my reasons." When Grandpa talked to me like that, I didn't push things any farther. Besides, it didn't make any difference to me if he marked on every single piece of paper in the store. I always managed to make my trips on Saturdays, as that was Coon Hunters' Day. I didn't have to stand around on the outside of the circle anymore and listen to the coon hunters. I get right up in the middle and say my piece with the rest of them. I didn't have to tell any whoppers, for some of the things my dogs did were almost unbelievable anyhow. Oh, I guess I did make things a little bigger than they actually were, but I never did figure a coon hunter told honest-to-goodness lies. He just kind of stretched things a little. I could hold those coon hunters spellbound with some of my hunting tales. Grandpa would never say anything while I was telling my stories. He just puttered around the store with a silly little grin on his face. Once in a while, when I got too far off the beaten path, he would come around and cram a bar of soap in my pocket. My face would get all red. I'd cut my story short, fly out the door, and head for home. The coon hunters were always kidding me about my dogs. Some of the remarks I heard made me fighting mad. I never saw hounds so small, but I guess they are hounds. At least they look like it. I don't believe little Ann is half as smart as he says she is. She's so little, those old coons think she's a rabbit. I bet she sneaks right up on them before they realize she's a dog. Some of these nights, a big old coon is gonna carry her off to his den and raise some little coon puppies. I always took their kidding with a smile on my face, but it made my blood boil like the water in Mama's tea kettle. I had one way of shutting them up. Let's all go in the store, I'd say, and see who has the most hides in there. It was true that my dogs were small, especially little Ann. She could walk under an ordinary hound. In fact, she was a regular midget. If it had not been for her long ears, no one could have told that she was a hound. Her actions weren't those of a hunting hound. She was constantly playing. She would play with our chickens and our young calves with a piece of paper or corn cob. What my little girl lacked in size, she made up in sweetness. She could make friends with a tomcat. Old Dan was just the opposite. He strutted around with a belligerent and tough attitude. Although he wasn't a tall dog, he was heavy. His body was long and his chest broad and thick. His legs were short, big, and solid. The muscles in his body were hard and knotty. When he walked, they would twist and jerk under the skin. He was a friendly dog. There were no strangers to him. He loved everyone. Yet he was a strange dog. He would not hunt with any other hound other than Little Ann or another hunter, not even my father. The strangest thing about old Dan was that he would not hunt, even with me, unless Little Ann was with him. I found this out the first night I tried it. Little Ann had cut the pad of her right foot on a sharp, jagged flint rock. It was a nasty cut. I made a little boot of leather and put it on her wounded foot. To keep her from following, I locked her in the corn crib. 2 nights later, I decided to take old Dan hunting for a while. He followed me down to the river bottoms and disappeared in the thick timber. I waited and waited for him to strike a trail. Nothing happened. After about 2 hours, I called to him. He didn't come. I called and called. Disgusted, I gave up and went home. Coming up through the barn lot, I saw him rolled up in the ball on the ground in the front of the corn crib. I immediately understood. I walked over and opened the door. He jumped up in the crib, smelled Little Ann's foot, twisted around in the shucks, and lay down by her side. As he looked at me, I read this message in his friendly gray eyes. You could have done this a long time ago. I never did know if Little Ann would hunt by herself or not. I'm sure she would have, for she was a smart and understanding dog, but I never tried to figure it out. Little Ann was my sister's pet. They rubbed and scratched and petted her. They would take her down to the creek and give her baths. She loved it all. If Mama wanted a chicken caught, she would call Little Ann. She would run the chicken down and hold it with her paws until Mama came. Not one feather would be harmed. Mama tried old Dan once, but before she got the chicken, there wasn't much left but the feathers. By some strange twist of nature, Little Ann was destined to go through life without being a mother. Perhaps it was because she was stunted in growth, or maybe because she was the runt in a large litter. That may have something to do with it. During the first season, November through February, I was given complete freedom from work. Many times when I came home, the sun was high in the sky. After each hunt, I always took care of my dogs. Flint rocks and sawbriars were hard on their feet. With a bottle of peroxide and a can of salve, I would doctor their wounds. I never knew what to expect from old Dan. I never saw a coonhound so determined or one that could get into so many predicaments. More than one time, it would have been the death of him if it hadn't been for smart Little Ann. One night, not long after I entered the bottoms, my dog struck the trail of an old boar coon. He was a smart old fella and had a sack full of tricks. He crossed the river time after time. Finally, swimming to the middle and staying in the swift current, he swam downstream. Knowing he would have to come out somewhere, my dogs split up. Old Dan took the right side, Little Ann worked the other side. I came out of the bottoms onto a gravel bar and stood and watched them in the moonlight. Little Ann worked downriver, and then she came up. I saw her when she passed me going up the bank, sniffing and searching for the trail. She came back to me. I patted her head, scratched her ears, and talked to her. She kept staring across the river to where old Dan was searching for the trail. She waded in and swam across to help him. I knew that the coon had not come out of the river on her side. If he had, she would have found the trail. I walked up to a riffle, pulled off my shoes, and waded across. My dogs worked the riverbank up and down. They circled far out into the bottoms. I could hear the loud snuffing of old Dan. He was bewildered and mad. I was getting a thrill from it all, as I had never seen them fooled like this. Old Dan gave up on his side, piled into the river, and swam across to the side Little Ann had worked. I knew that it was useless for him to do that. I was on the point of giving up, calling them to me, and going somewhere else to hunt, when I heard the bawl of Little Ann. I couldn't believe what I heard. She wasn't bawling on a trail. She was sounding the tree bark. I hurried down the bank. There was a loud splash. I saw old Dan swimming back. By this time, Little Ann was really singing a song. In the bright moonlight, I could see old Dan clearly. His powerful front legs were churning the water. Then I saw a sight that makes a hunter's heart swell with pride. Still swimming, old Dan raised his head high out of the water and bawled. He couldn't wait until he reached the bank to tell Little Ann he was coming. Far out in the river, he told her. Reaching the shallows, he plowed out of the river onto a sandbar. Not even taking time to shake the water from his body, again he raised his head and bawled and tore out down the bank. In a trot, I followed, whooping to let them know I was coming. Before I reached the tree, old Dan's deep voice was making the timber shake. The tree was a large birch, standing right on the bank of the river. The swift current had eaten away at the footing, causing it to lean. The lower branches of the tree dangled in the water. I saw how the smart old coon had pulled his trick. Coming in towards the bank from midstream, he had caught the dangling limbs and climbed up. Exhausted from the long swim, he stayed there in the birch, thinking he had outsmarted my dogs. I couldn't understand how Little Ann had found him. It was impossible to follow the tree toward the bottoms. It was too much off balance. I did the next best thing. I cut a long elder switch. Unbuckling one of my suspenders, I tied it to the end and climbed the tree. The coon was sitting in a fork of a limb. Taking my switch, I whooped him a good one, and out he came. He sailed out over the river. With a loud splash, he hit the water and swam for the other side. My dogs jumped off the bank after him. They were no match against his expert swimming. On reaching the other bank, he ran downriver. Climbing down out of the tree, I picked up my axe and lantern and trotted down to another riffle and waded across. I could tell by the bawling of my dogs they were close to the coon. He would have to climb a tree or be caught on the ground. All at once, their voices stopped. I stood still and waited for them to bawl treed. Nothing happened. Thinking the coon had taken the river again, I waited to give them time to reach the opposite bank. I waited and waited. I could hear nothing. By then I knew he had not crossed over. I thought perhaps they had caught him on the ground, so I hurried on. I came to a point where a slough of crystal clear water ran into the river. On the other side was a bluff. I could hear one of my dogs over there. As I watched and waited, I heard a dog jump in the water. It was Little Ann. She swam across and came up to me. Staying with me for just a second, she jumped into the slough and ran back and swam back to the other side. I could hear her sniffing and whining. I couldn't figure out where old Dan was. By squatting down and holding the lantern high over my head, I could dimly see the opposite bank. Little Ann was running up and down. I noticed she always stayed in one place of about 25 yards, never leaving that small area. She ran down to the water's edge and stared out into the slough. The horrible thought came that old Dan had drowned. I knew a big coon was capable of drowning a dog in water by climbing on his head and forcing him under. As fast as I could run, I circled the slough, climbed up over the bluff, and came down to see where little Ann was. She was hysterical, running up and down the bank and whining. I tied my lantern on a long pole, held it out over the water, and looked for old Dan's body. I could see clearly in the clear spring waters, but I couldn't see my dog anywhere. I sat down on the bank, buried my face in my hands, and cried. I was sure he was gone. Several minutes passed, and all that time little Ann had never stopped. Running here and there along the bank, she kept sniffing and whining. I heard when she started digging. I looked around. She was 10 feet from the water's edge. I got up and went over to her. She was digging in a small hole about the size of a big apple. It was the air hole for a muskrat den. I pulled little Ann away from the hole, knelt down, and put my ear to it. I could hear something, feel a vibration in the ground. It was an eerie sound and seemed to be coming from far away. I listened. Finally, I understood what the noise was. It was the voice of old Dan. Little Ann had opened the hole up enough with her digging so his voice could be heard faintly. In some way, he had gotten into that old muskrat den. I knew that down under the bank, in the water, the entrance to the den could be found. Rolling up my sleeve, I tried to find it with my hand. I had no luck. It was too far down. There was only one thing to do. Leaving my axe and lantern, I ran for home. Picking up a long-handled shovel, I hurried back. The sun was high in the sky before I dug old Dan out. He was a sight to see. Nothing but mud from the tip of his nose to the end of his tail. I held onto his collar and led him down to the river to wash him off. The water there was much warmer than the cold spring water of the slough. After washing him, I turned him loose. Right back to the hole he ran. Little Ann was already digging. I knew the coon was still there. Working together, we dug him out. After the coon was killed, I saw what had made him so smart. His right foot was twisted and shriveled. At one time, he must have been caught in a trap and had pulled himself free. He was an old coon. His face was almost white. He was big and heavy and had beautiful fur. Tired, muddy, wet, and hungry, I started for home. I often wondered how old Dan got into the old muskrat den. Perhaps there was another entrance I had overlooked. I'll never know. One night, far back in the mountains, in a place called the Cyclone Timber, old Dan really pulled a good one. Many years before my time, a terrible cyclone had ripped its way through the mountains, leaving its scar in the form of fallen timber, twisted and snarled. The path of the cyclone was several miles wide and several miles long. It was a wonderful place to hunt, as it was abounded with game. My dogs had struck the trail of a coon about an hour before. They had really been warming him up. I knew it was about time for him to take up a tree, and sure enough, I heard the deep voice of old Dan telling the world that he had a coon up there. I was trotting along, going to him, when his voice stopped. I could hear little Ann, but not old Dan. I wondered why, and was a little scared, for I just knew something had happened. Then I heard his voice. It seemed louder than it had been before. I felt much better. When I came up to the tree, I thought little Ann had treed old Dan. She was sitting on her haunches staring up and balling the tree bark. There, a good 15 feet from the ground, was his hind legs planted firmly in the center of a big limb, and his front feet against the trunk of the tree stood old Dan, bawling for all he was worth. Above him, some 8 or 9 feet, was a baby coon. I was glad it was a young one, for if it had been an old one, he would have jumped out. Old Dan would have followed, and he surely would have broken all of his legs. From where I was standing, I could see it was impossible for old Dan to have climbed the tree. It was dead and more of an old snag than a tree, with limbs that were crooked and twisted. The bar had rotted away and fallen off, leaving the trunk bare and slick as glass. It was a good 10 feet up to the first limb. I couldn't figure out how old Dan had climbed that tree. there had to have been a solution somewhere. Walking around to the other side, I saw how he had accomplished his feat. There in the bottom was a large hole. The old tree was hollow. Stepping back, I looked up and could see another hole, which had been hidden from me because of old Dan's body. He had simply crawled into the hole at the bottom, climbed up the hollow of the tree, and worked his way out on the limb. In some ways, he had turned around and reared up, placing his front feet against the trunk. There he was. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't cut the tree down, and I was afraid to climb it for fear I would scare the coon into jumping out. If he did, old Dan would jump too and break his legs. I ran plan after plan around in my mind. None would work. I finally came to the conclusion that I had to climb the tree and get a hold of that crazy dog. I blew out my lantern, pulled off my socks and shoes, and started shimmying up the tree. I prayed that the coon wouldn't jump out. Inching along, being as quiet as I could, I made it up to old Dan and grabbed his collar. I sat down on a limb and held him tight. He would bawl now and then, and all but burst my eardrums. I couldn't drop him to the ground, and I couldn't climb down with him. I couldn't sit there on that limb and hold him all night. I'd be no better when the daylight came. Glancing at the hole by my side gave me the solution to my problem. I thought, well, if he came out of this hole, he can go back in. That was the way I got my dog down from that tree. This had its problems, too. In the first place, old Dan didn't want to be put in a hole head first. By scolding, pushing, shoving, and squeezing, I finally got him started on his way. Like a fool, I sat there on the limb, waiting to see him come out at the bottom, and come out he did. Turning around, bawling as he did, right back into the hole he went. There was nothing I could do but sit and wait. I understood why his voice had stopped for a while. He just took time out to climb a tree. Put my ear to the hole, I could hear him coming. Grunting and clawing up he came. I helped him out of the hole, turned him around, and crammed him back in. That time I wasn't too gentle with my work. I was tired of sitting on the limb. My bare feet were getting cold. I started down the same time he did. He beat me down. Looking over my shoulder, I saw him turn around and head back for the hole. I wasn't far from the ground, so I let go. The flint rocks didn't feel too good on my feet when I landed. I jumped to the hole just in time to see the tip end of his long tail disappearing. I grabbed it. Holding on with one hand, I worked his legs down with my other and pulled him out. I stopped his tree climbing by cramming rocks and chunks into the hole. How the coon stayed in the tree, I'll never know, but stay he did. With a well-armed rock, I scared him out. Old Dan satisfied his lust for kill. I started for home. I'd had all the hunting I wanted for that night.